Welcome to the Elephant in the Room with Bradley Devlin. I, of course, am Bradley Devlin. Thank you for joining us for the first time ever in a video format available on YouTube. And if you're listening, just as you usually are on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, SoundCloud, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure to leave a review and a comment on any of our streaming platforms. It really helps us out, and we really appreciate all of your support. And that's why we are going to bring you so much content. I mean, this episode is full of really great information. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. So if you haven't heard, we're in a pandemic. I know it's crazy. It's news to me too. And in response to said pandemic, the Trump administration, as well as many other governors and mayors of major cities, have initiated serious lockdowns of the U.S. economy that affects all non-essential business entities. I mean, it really is like we threw the e-brake on this thing. Of course, all of this for now is not unwarranted, as coronavirus has infected over 500,000 people worldwide and has taken the lives of nearly 25,000 as of Thursday evening. And without social distancing measures and other precautions taken by both government and everyday Americans, were indeed necessary to make sure this thing didn't get ugly and get ugly fast and overwhelm our healthcare system like we've seen in Italy, and possibly even have more disastrous impacts on the economy than the grim economic projections are saying right now. The coronavirus has already wiped out the entirety of the gains made in the US stock market under President Trump, which is worth mentioning even though it's not a good metric to measure the overall economy, because it affects people's savings, their 401ks, and the wealth of many people who act as creditors in the US economy. I mean, throwing the e-brake on this thing has pretty much guaranteed a recession in the US economy and beyond. Current projections from Goldman Sachs says the economy will grow at -6% in quarter one, -24% in quarter two, and then +12 in quarter three and +10 in quarter four. Full year growth would be measured at -3.8% given these numbers come to bear. And these latest numbers were much different than they were just 11 days ago when Goldman Sachs adjusted their first quarter GDP growth forecast to 0 from 0.7% and had a 5% contraction in the second quarter. Now compare this to the growth rate of quarter three and quarter four in 2019 in real terms, which was 2.1%, and you can see just how quickly the coronavirus has thrown it all out of whack at an ever-increasing rate. Now, let's make a note, though, that Goldman Sachs numbers are much more dire than, let's say, UBS or DB's or BFA's numbers. So I'm giving you what it seems to be the worst-case scenario here. Now, the government-mandated closure of all non-essential businesses has led to the largest week spike in unemployment claims in U.S. history. As CNBC reported, Americans displaced by the coronavirus crisis filed unemployment claims in record numbers last week, with the Labor Department reporting Thursday a surge to 3.28 million. The number shatters the Great Recession peak of 665,000 in March of 2009 and the all-time mark of 695,000 in October of 1982. The previous week, which reflected the period before the worst of the coronavirus hit, was 282,000, which was higher than expected at the time. Those numbers, maybe not the rate, but definitely those numbers in total are expected to rise, obviously, as this continues to go on. However, I might add that there are positives to all of this, even as New York's healthcare system is headed to be overwhelmed. Sweden has not enacted the draconian lockdown measures, and they seem to be doing just fine as of now, and I believe Denmark is in a similar boat, so we'll all definitely be looking at their economic and public health data in the aftermath of all of this. Also, Great Britain's public health experts are revising their death estimates. Remember, those same folks who predicted 2.2 million deaths or something crazy like that, and then, of course, they went viral because of it. Well, yeah, now those experts are predicting 20,000 deaths, which is absolutely terrible, of course. Every single death is a tragedy for every one of those individuals, every one of their friends, and all of their families, and, of course, all of us, too, because we're all in this together. But clearly, 20,000 is much better than 2 million. Now, back to the economy. As you know, since last weekend, Congress has been working on a stimulus package for the American economy due to the measures taken to combat the coronavirus pandemic. And the stimulus package is much different than the bailouts that we saw in 2008, for example. which is why the Senate bill received unanimous approval last night and is awaiting action in the House, which we'll get into all of that very, very soon. But right, the cost-benefit analysis, which is happening at the time, which I believe is correct for the time being, of course, said that the long-term ramifications of the coronavirus having its way with the American people was worth the unexpected shutdown in this black swan type of event. And so the government cracking down on the economy like this means there ought to be some sort of damages compensation, right? If I hit you with my car, I ought to pay your medical bills. It's as simple as that. And that's effectively what government did with all of these lockdowns. But even with this bipartisan consensus of all this, we still don't have a stimulus package passed. Granted, this thing would be the largest stimulus in U.S. history, if not world history, definitely in nominal terms, but also I believe in real terms as well. So let's walk through exactly what happened this week and the shape up of this whole thing, because it's really indicative of where the Democrats' priorities lie. And let me tell you, it ain't with the American people. I'll tell you that straight off the bat. Over the weekend, Senate Republicans bargained with Democrats to negotiate a $1.8 trillion stimulus spending bill to protect American businesses from suffering long-term financial harm and aid in COVID-19 relief efforts. This bill, just like everything that comes out of Washington, and really anything government does more broadly, was definitely flawed in some ways, as some of the industry-specific provisions could be ripe for being taken advantage of in a cronyist type of critique laid out by the Heritage Foundation, for example. But obviously, with the numbers I gave you previously and the GDP growth predictions getting worse by the second, it seems something was better than nothing. And this package was seemingly gaining traction on both sides of the aisle. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer basically came out and endorsed the thing and praised Mitch McConnell over how he handled the politics of the bill, bringing Democrats to the table. And here's what that sounded like.
Struggling Americans are going to go to their mailboxes and find four-figure checks to help with their bills. Why? Because the Senate stepped
But Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, whom the left heralds as a genius legislator and political mastermind, intervened at the last possible minute and derailed this whole thing. Pelosi said they'd draft their own version of an emergency bill, you know, similar to the types of bills she has drafted by like 6 of her staffers and whose details are withheld from even her own caucus. Yeah, remember that? She held this thing up because she said it was too pro-business. All right, her solutions and proposals on remedying the bill, like all good progressive technocrats like Pelosi, is to make American people, particularly the poor and disadvantaged who are getting hit most by this thing, permanent wards of the state. She really put a whooping on Chuck Schumer because he turned right around and also started bashing this thing as being too pro-business, parroting all of not even the Democrats, because the Democrats seem to support some type of stimulus now, but Pelosi and the progressives, like the Squad's political priorities. Democratic leadership said they wanted an immense increase in the size and scale of unemployment insurance that go beyond jobs lost due to the coronavirus, more funding for healthcare, which Republicans had already matched in this demand, and a demand that industry-specific directed monies go to workers, which meant that the receivers of these loans or funds couldn't lay off or cut the benefits for any of their workers without any sort of time provision. So, I mean, that's all they know. They accept the loan and they can no longer fire anyone in perpetuity, which is just great for the prospect of allowing these businesses to make economically rational decisions to keep them afloat. I mean, this is borderline nationalization, and it's a huge encroachment onto the business leaders who, as I said, are trying to make rational choices on their business functions to make sure that they come out on the other side of this thing and can actually put people back to work, right? If there is no business, there is no jobs, and there is no job creation. So the Democrats' plan early this week was to pay people their full salaries for the entirety of the time the U.S. economy could initiate a V-shaped recovery, right? That 6-month provision to include full unemployment benefits, and make businesses then unable to make rational decisions to stay alive so that they could employ more people in the future. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous. Now, what else did Pelosi want to do earlier in the week? She wanted over $33 million for the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, $100 million for NASA, $100 million for environmental compliance, $278 million for the IRS, $35 million for the Kennedy Center, $90 million for an HIV/AIDS program. Wrong disease there, buddy. Wrong disease. $36 million for the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, and no one knows what that is or what it does, but apparently it needs a fat wad of cash because coronavirus. $23 million for Howard University, a university that sits on a 9-figure endowment valued over at $500 million. And another $300 million for PBS, another $500 million for some libraries and museums institute. I mean, newsflash, Nancy, they're all closed. Really, they're all closed. $300 million for migration and refugee assistance while all the borders are basically closed to anything but essential business travel. Also, in doling out federal loans, she also mandates the use of credit institutions owned or run by minorities, as well as establishing corporate board diversity quotas for corporations that receive federal loans over a certain size, as well as federal election oversight funding. And really, what I mentioned here are just the chicharrones, the processed fried pork skin of all the pork that Nancy Pelosi crammed into this bill to advance their political priorities while the American people and American businesses suffer. I mean, I would know. My father has already had to lay off essentially half of his workforce, and that only gets worse when you incentivize people to not work and to jump out of the labor force, and you force businesses into a position that prohibits them from ramping up production and rehiring workers as we try to make a V-shaped recovery. I mean, that's the Democratic program for jobs and restarting the economy. I mean, thank God Hillary Clinton isn't president right now, because these things could have actually become a reality had the orange man not been in there, and really Mitch McConnell in the Senate. That's the key to this whole thing. Mitch McConnell, Cocaine Mitch, doing a great job. Great job, Cocaine Mitch. And you know, the Republican bill, it ain't no rose, but it sure as heck is better than the heap of garbage that Pelosi has been pushing all early this week. And they're not hiding the ball here. I mean, Democrats have long been keen on never letting a good crisis go to waste. Yeah, that's Rahm Emanuel, former Obama chief of staff and mayor of Chicago, by the way. Rightfully, Republicans were outraged over all of this when they initially showed restraint, but Nancy Pelosi just couldn't help but eat the fruit from the poisonous tree. Here's what Senator Sass and Senator Cruz had to say about that. Obviously, Sass and Cruz are right about these things. Senator Kennedy even said that Democrats were acting like a-holes on the Senate floor. That's a quote, a-holes. And Lindsey Graham says he hasn't been so disgusted since the Kavanaugh debacle, which we saw, oh my gosh, what it feels like 10 years ago now, but really it was only 2 years ago. After Democrats blocked the rescue package early this week, Dow futures fell 5%, halting trading, and the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in the country surpassed 32,000. Despite how disastrous all these Democratic priorities would have been, as they're calling them, it hasn't stopped the media for running cover of Pelosi, the political mastermind, and, of course, the priorities of the Democrats. On Sunday and into Monday, the New York Times was forced to change their headline for the story talking about Nancy Pelosi's politicking 3 different times. The first headline read, Democrats block action on $1.8 trillion stimulus. Then that headline became, Democrats block action on stimulus plans seeking worker protections. Justified now. Before they settled, of course, the final one, the third and final headline was, partisan divide threatens deal on rescue bill. Oh my goodness. And I mean, obviously, you can see why the first headline had to be changed. It rightly assigned responsibility to Democrats for holding this whole thing up. And it was like just so close. They were so close to some honest reporting over there at the New York Times. But alas, that is not going to be the case anytime soon, I have a feeling. So Pelosi was happy to leave all this in limbo on Wednesday as she gavelled the House of Representatives out of session without bringing a Senate bill passed on Tuesday to vote. Pelosi stated that the House Democrats will now review the final provisions and legislative text of the agreement to determine a course of action. The Senate continued to revise their provisions in the bill Wednesday in an attempt to get the House moving on this, passing the updated stimulus bill by a vote of 96-0 and sending it to the House for a vote. As of Thursday, as of this recording, that has yet to happen, and if Pelosi doesn't pass this thing, it will become woefully clear where the Democrats' allegiance truly lies, and that is accumulating political power under the guise of a false sense of moral superiority based on some random intersectional priorities that have nothing to do at all with the coronavirus and the American people, and that's something the American people ought to remember and make them hurt for it when election time rolls around this November. Real quick, here's where the Senate has left this thing waiting on the House to pass it and send it to the president. The Senate unanimously passed the largest stimulus bill in history on Wednesday night, amounting to $2.2 trillion in relief measures. These These measures include, well, at least the major ones of this bill include extending $1,200 to most American adults and $5,000 for most children, a $500 billion lending program for businesses, cities, and states, as well as a $367 billion retention fund for small businesses. $130 billion will also be directed towards hospitals and 4 months of expanded unemployment insurance. The bill also provides $250 billion to make unemployment insurance available to more categories of workers and extend the duration of benefits from 29 weeks, as is typical in most states, to 36 weeks. It attempted to provide an additional $600 a week for 4 months, but I believe that was corrected after senators were like, whoa. We're not going to be paying people who are on unemployment more than they would be getting in the workforce. That disincentivizes them to enter the labor force again and restart the American economy. So I believe in total there's $301 billion or something like that in direct payments to households. $349 billion in loans will be provided to small businesses. The amount spent on payroll, rents, and utilities will be converted into grants that don't have to be repaid. $500 billion for loans, loan guarantees, and other aid to businesses, states, and municipalities. This means that there's a possibility the government will take direct stakes in equity companies, which I don't know. That we'll see how that goes. There's also $32 billion to cover wages and grants to passenger air carriers, cargo air carriers, and contractors, and $150 billion in direct aid to states, $221 billion in tax benefits for businesses, and $340 billion for supplemental spending. Funds were also set aside for the Kennedy Center at around $25 million and the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So, alas, pork remains in the legislation just like all bills coming out of Washington, D.C. There's a reason why people don't trust politicians, and I wonder why. And I think it's completely justified. I am with you on that boat. I'd also be remiss if I don't do the thing that every fiscal conservative should be doing at the moment, and that is discussing the deficit and debt when we're talking about the largest stimulus bill in U.S. history. There's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has interfered with the livelihoods of the American people, which is why we should be saving during the good times so that we can spend when the bad times inevitably come and aren't increasing expeditiously the fiscal and financial stress on the U.S. government and the U.S. economy when those bad times do come, as I said before. The Heritage Foundation is right to point out that the actions taken by Congress should be focused on how to lift us out of the crisis, doing what they can to limit the potential for abuses of political power that can rise up during time of pandemic. Furthermore, we need to be careful just how much authority we're granting to the U.S. Treasury Department and Congress to authorize and guarantee these loans and possibly take equity positions, as they'd surely be less effective at assessing the risk and doling out these loans as private financial institution, and as seen by the government's gross incompetence in the politics surrounding this whole thing. Also, enabling the federal government to participate and possibly even usurp, in some cases, business gains could be disastrous, as it will grant them control of how these companies are being run. Again, this doesn't mean we shouldn't provide benefits to those who are really suffering because of the COVID-19 outbreak, but we need to be constantly reassessing this rapidly evolving situation and make worthwhile cost-benefit analysis on all government action, ranging from the provision of health materials and testing to injecting liquidity into the economy and providing people with assistance. As it stands now, our national debt is currently about $23 trillion, a dangerous amount that exceeds the size of the U.S. economy in a given year. And the Heritage Foundation has a fantastic way to think about this. Imagine the government is a household, an average household in the United States with a median income of $52,000. Well, the U.S. government, if it were that household, would be spending $64,000 a year. And that extra $12,000, that'd be put right on the credit card when they are already over $300,000 into credit card debt. And so the stimulus package is only going to increase these numbers, obviously, and we wouldn't let any sane person live like this, yet the government continues to do so. So again, we need to be saving and showing financial restraint in the good times. If our politicians are serious about lifting us out of this pandemic and its economic consequences, and they're serious about preparing for black swan events like this in the future, then Republicans and Democrats need to get their acts together to create properly incentivized support systems that keeps employees in the workforce, prevents business failures, and does not recklessly increase the burden of debt. Again, restraint in the good times so that we can spend in the bad. All right, that's it for the breakdown today. Now it is time for pros and cons. And on Wednesday, I caught up with a pal of mine, Tyler Grant, who is keeping a close eye on China and everything it is doing. It's like a big BP oil spill, I'm sorry, PR campaign. But really what the CCP is doing is saying that it is perfect in every way, and it's super humanitarian and respectful of human rights, and that the U.S. military is responsible for the virus coronavirus, so I caught up with Tyler. Here's what that looked like. All right, so now it is time for pros and cons, where I bring on a conservative writer, a conservative activist, or a politician or professional think tanker, as I like to call them, onto the show to interview them about what exactly is going on about whatever issue we're tackling today. And obviously, we've been tackling this issue for the last 2-3 weeks now, the coronavirus. Today, joining me is Tyler Grant. He's a lawyer, poet, Fulbright fellow, triathlete, Renaissance man, and someone I consider a China expert, but also a Tyler expert. Tyler, long time no see, and thank you for coming on to the show.
Yeah, for having me, Brad.
All right, so on this show last week, I broke down the full timeline of how China and its communist leadership bungled this thing from the get-go as an explanation for why this virus is justifiably called the Chinese virus. And what we've been doing on the show is trying to add emphasis on the communist side of this equation, that it is a product of communism necessitating sole control over the dissemination of information to maintain political legitimacy and power. So we're trying to shift that dialogue and change the name to the more aptly called, in my opinion, Chinese Communist Party virus, or the CCPV, as one of my Twitter followers pointed out. I like that for short. So after I did that last week for the show, I saw your great piece in the Washington Examiner explaining exactly this phenomenon. For the viewers, it's called Useful Idiocracy. Go check it out in full. But Tyler, for the listeners who are busy driving or working while they're listening to the show, summarize what you did with this piece for us.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I decided that I wanted to write a piece after I saw countless journalists, Twitter personalities writing these oddly, what seemed like cover for the Chinese Communist Party, where what you have to understand is anytime you see propaganda information coming out of China, anything that seems too good to be true, it probably is. And I saw more often than not people. The first instance that really shook me was seeing China is sending aid to the Italians, and I was like, well, they probably sold it to the Italians. They didn't send free aid, and that turned out to be exactly what it was. They sent the Chinese doctors, of which they, were the experts that had been in Wuhan and experienced what had gone on there to help the Italians, but also had sent them a bunch of ventilators and a bunch of medical equipment. But what we found out is that those were already pre-existing orders and sales. And so I started digging into this and seeing more and more often these journalists posting these articles and different emphasis of different ways in which the Chinese were actually better at response to the coronavirus and the way the Trump administration's handling it. And I just thought that analysis was absolutely bizarre. So I started writing it up, and the more those articles came out, the more that the Chinese Communist Party was echoing those points, thereby completing the feedback loop where they could show to the people, oh, look, like even American journalists agree with us that this is bungled by the Trump administration. We handled it, we curbed it, and now we're helping the world and we're the leader on it, which is exactly what Beijing wanted to do, and they had bungled it the whole time. So in essence, we could talk about the way that the Trump administration handled it relative to the way that Beijing handled it. But at the same time, you should never find yourself in a position where you're giving any ammunition whatsoever to the Chinese Communist Party, and frankly, a lot of American journalists did.
And I think that's a perfect and great summarization of an even greater article. One part I particularly enjoyed is how you introduce the instances where the media is indeed covering for the CCP, as you say. As you say in the article, it is to be expected that the Chinese Communist Party is pushing disinformation around its mishandling of the virus that originated within its country's borders. What's worse is that American journalists running similar cover for the party. New York Times reporter Ian Johnson wrote a piece last week entitled, "China Bought the West Time, the West Squandered It." Not to be outdone, which I think it's a perfect way to put the media's response to this whole thing. Atlantic staff writer Anne Applebaum authored her own called "The Coronavirus Called America's Bluff," using a pro-colonialism hook. I'm sure that will go over well at Upper East Side cocktail parties. Applebaum's argument is nothing more than an elaborate bit of whataboutism, essentially claiming that while China's response was bad, President Trump's response could potentially be much worse and thus put us on par with China, as if the Trump administration and the Chinese are equally situated in the spread of the virus. And here I took this as that all the hubbub in the media, right? The calls of racism and xenophobia and attacking the president for spreading quote unquote false hope is really at its core just another get Trump attack and a symptom of the Trump derangement syndrome. Now, while there are definitely valid criticisms of the president, I've highlighted them in our show about the handling of this crisis. To what extent do you think this is true? And if it's not Trump derangement syndrome, what do you think it is, and why is it happening?
So I think the most apt metaphor that I've used, and I've seen other people express similar views as well, is it's as if a house is on fire in the woods, and the Chinese government, being the initial responders, tell everybody that actually it's just a house in the woods, they've got it contained. And so, while the fire department down the road is prepared, they're not immediately trying to respond because they don't think anything's up. Suddenly, house in the woods loses containment, starts burning the forest, and people start seeing it burns faster and faster and faster, catching everything else on fire. Now, the other fire department down the street, not prepared and being told different information about the cottage in the woods, is now underprepared to deal with a forest fire of epic proportions. And that's what's happened. And you've seen all these people try to equate this bizarre false equivalency between what the Chinese Communist Party knew, could have known, and did in response to what the Trump administration did, while at the same time undercutting the very things of which he did in the first place. So, when it first broke down, obviously there's been just multiple instances of the media saying, "Don't worry about it. The racism that comes out of this will be worse than the actual virus." Then he shuts down the border with China. Well, now we're going into xenophobia territory. Like, well, actually, wow, this is really spreading quickly. Why didn't he do this all sooner? And frankly, when it comes to national disasters, certainly health disasters, a lot of a similar type of idea with 9/11, where it's like, well, how did they not know that this was going on? And actually they did know, but they should have acted more quickly, etc. And what you come to realize is that some of this, they're making actual policy decisions based upon what they think could or could not happen. I surprised a lot of people when I had this discussion the other day on a kind of a Zoom call with some different reporters, when I said, actually in Madagascar, every few years the bubonic plague comes back around, kills a couple hundred people every time. And the last time it happened was like in 2017. Never hear about that. You never see the borders shut down in Madagascar. You see minimal containment by the WHO. You don't hear the UN talking about it. You don't hear the CDC talking about it. Similar thing happened with this instance, where people said, hey, a couple people are dying in Wuhan of a novel type of virus. It's similar to pneumonia, and it's killing some people. And so I'm sure that all these professionals were telling Trump particular things, and Trump was saying, okay, let's keep an eye on it. And the more that this happened, the more people realize, well, wait a minute, this is escalating quickly. And you've seen the ramp up that's happened recently. And I think 2016 broke a lot of people's brains and made them think, my responsibility as a journalist, as a writer, as a thinker, is to undercut what the other team is doing, because if I'm not doing that, I'm somehow enabling them. And I think that works both ways. But I think in this instance, you're seeing it more clearly, because I saw, for example, I saw a lady that Trump had said, I want to get the economy open back up by Easter. I'd love to get it open back up by Easter. She tweets out a response to that saying, Trump sets a deadline for Easter for opening back up the economy. And you just look at that, and on its face, you just see that that's not true. But this is somebody for CNBC. You see people on MSNBC mischaracterize, Trump doesn't turn open the Defense Protection Act or whatever it's called. And he's asked every single press conference, have you used the Defense Protection Act? He says, yeah, we authorize the use of it. We know that we can do it. But every time we engage these private companies to do something, they agree to do it. We don't have to mobilize them to do it because they agree to do it. So rather than the federal government having to coerce you by force, which is what the act essentially is, they're having people voluntarily turning their business machinations to do the thing that they said that they wanted to do. But then you see people on Twitter echo the point, well, the president's not doing something because he's not using this particular thing. And you just kind of look at that like, why are you people constantly trying to undermine your own credibility? So yeah, I mean, to your question, I think 2016 broke a lot of people. I think Trump derangement syndrome is very much so a syndrome on both teams, that I have to protect my team at all cost, and I don't care the means and mechanisms that I have to do to get there.
And you pointed out some great overt lies coming from the press on China's handling of the coronavirus from the outset. In your article, you just mentioned some new ones that I had never heard of that I think are fantastic. But we also see lies of omission, which can be just as damaging, but even more pernicious. And you make this point quite clearly in your piece when you say, from a global response perspective, it was widely reported that China was sending experts, ventilators, and masks to Italy. Applebaum and many others applauded the move as demonstration of Chinese global leadership dwarfing the Trump administration's response to the pandemic. Of course, this framing lacked the fundamental context, which is the context that you already mentioned earlier in the podcast. As the Washington Post later reported, those shipments of goods are, in at least some cases, not donations, but rather exports of goods for purchase. And 1,000 ventilators is a decent deal for a country trying to get its business sector restarted. So Tyler, you mentioned those lies of omission, but now give our viewers and listeners the details on what China is doing currently from a global aid perspective.
Yeah, so I always think it's really funny, just to come back to the point about them being the global leader. I've seen this talking point now several times. I've seen it in Xinhua. I've also seen different party officials try to push that out as a talking point. And I always think that's like kind of fascinating. It's as if the Chinese released like a criminal into the world, and rather than being like, oh, hey, like, we're going to help you, we're going to send cops to help find the person, we're going to send you like weapons and help defend against it. Oh, but when we catch the person, we want you to tell us how great we are at catching criminals, rather than being like, man, well, you guys really need to talk about your containment strategies and your different prisons. And that's what's happening. You're looking at this like, how can you run cover for these people? Like, they clearly let something out into the world, and they lied about the samples. They lied and buried evidence. They've disappeared God knows how many people, two that we know of, two that are very prominent, and a doctor that died of his illness because they put him into a forced quarantine. They were pulling people out of their homes, giving misinformation about the levels of the disease, such that Vox, Washington Post, New York Times were talking about how minimal this was relative to the flu. I mean, they said that, and now their talking point is, well, actually, Trump is saying that. It's this crazy gaslighting, false equivalency that we will never see this level again with any other person. I'm convinced of. It's just, there's something about him that just broke people's minds, and they have to get him. But on the second point about like what they're trying to do, I mean, I've seen a couple of instances, they're trying to send global aid. I mean, there's been some sort of what Angela Merkel called reciprocity with information and medical equipment that they sent from Germany to China, and now China's sending it back to Europe and Germany. And she called that reciprocity, which actually was kind of interesting. A word choice, rather than being like, thank you for sending this. She's like, no, we sent you a bunch of stuff, you owed us, thanks. Which I find to be kind of a peculiar usage, especially coming from someone like Angela Merkel. But also, you've seen China's been really leaning on their African resources. I mean, there's a really interesting book, China's Second Continent, that talking about all the resources that they're pulling from Africa. I think they're using a lot of those resources to send around the world and create different trade relationships. And it's unclear, at least from what I've been reading, whether or not those relationships are actually considered aid, or if they're being considered some sort of sale agreement. But I think more will come on that. But it at this point looks like it's aid. But I think some of this will come out that no, China was just exploiting like trade agreements. But it was interesting, because in my piece it did talk about this. Ventilators, I mean, they're needing to make big time sales. These are very expensive pieces of equipment, and what better way to get your economy restarted than a huge sale of thousands of ventilators? And that's what they're doing, at least from the Italian perspective.
I think that I also let's jump back to the press. I also couldn't help but notice the commonalities between the press's statements and the action of the left during the Cold War, covering for the USSR. I mean, these leftists are folks that Stalinists in Russia called useful idiots, which I believe is where you drew the name from your article. So if our listeners don't know, explain for them the commonalities between these two phenomena, and why will this present day iteration do damage, if not on par, or to what extent will the damage be compared to that of the useful idiots during the Cold War?
Yeah, so I'm not a super Cold War expert, so I guess I'm from a propaganda standpoint, of which I am very familiar. I think that what we're seeing is the feedback loop of which I talked about, which is they get journalists from a foreign country to repeat that information, and then they use that information as vindication of their initial piece of information that they sent out, and using it and citing it as evidence of that. I think as far as the USSR, the Cold War, I mean, what we don't understand as Americans is we like to play the game and thinking that the game is all about ourselves, and that everything that we say is in this like little loop of an American idea, and people that are pushing out these little think pieces in Washington Post and the Atlantic and all this stuff. Oh no, those are just for our learning and our edification, rather than saying, oh wow, actually this Atlantic piece that I wrote that I was really proud of, that promotes the CCP. The CCP is now walking it out and trotting it around China as, look, American journalists are saying that we're doing a great job, and that's how we're staying in power. And so that happens with any of these articles. And so it's not so much, I don't think that we can make nuanced critiques of the Trump administration and giving relative grades for Trump administration versus the CCP's administration and handling of the crisis. But I think you have to come at it with like a good faith effort of like, is what I'm doing here, is it actually promoting an interesting idea that is furthering Americanism, American lives, or is this something that can be used as a tool in the CCP tool belt? And if the answer is the latter, I think you really need to put it back in the holster and not use it, because what it was and will continue to happen. Because before this, people forget, I wrote a couple articles for the Washington Examiner, Human Events, National Review, and others about the Chinese were exerting a social credit score system and a social set of rules that are so severe and so restricted that no American thinks such like liberty reducing mechanisms. But they were already doing that, and they were using the CCP. The CCP loves to do that. They're using information on people. And they're using, oh, look what the West is doing. Do you want to what the West is doing? You're be willing to accept less liberty, because if not, this is what happens in the West. And so like that division, that dissension, all of that kind of stuff leads to the West looking bad relative to the CCP in the way that the CCP spends their information to their people. So, I mean, from a propaganda standpoint, that's kind of what I think is happening. I think it'll get worse, frankly. I mean, I think the CCP gets stronger every time a crisis happens, and they handle it and are able to propagate that they handled it better than the West. And it also just shows people are willing to sacrifice. I mean, we saw this in this country after 9/11. We're going to see it further after this crisis, I'm sure. People are willing to accept less liberty if it means more safety. That's just the way it is. That's the way it always has been. That's the way it always will be. And so in order for them to propagate, hey, look how the Americans handled it. Outbreak spread to the whole country. More people died there than died here. And we kept you safe. Even if that's not true, which I find their numbers to be very, very debatable and suspicious. But once they say that, they'll be able to say, look, we did that, they didn't, trust us. And their party, they get stronger because of it.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really, really good point about being skeptical of the data coming out of China, specifically in the past week, as they said, as they've recorded basically no deaths over a certain period of time span, or no new cases, I think is what it was. And simultaneously, they've engaged in this massive disinformation campaign, and they've, after they've already been known for suppressing medical information, not only to their own citizens and to the world during this crisis, but the press isn't seeming to question this data coming out of China. Obviously, I think this is a little bit of a softball, but should we be questioning that data? And what do you think is going on right now in China?
Always, it's interesting because there's been several instances of the Chinese heavily lying about their infrastructure numbers, heavily lying about their employment numbers, heavily lying about their GDP numbers. And, looking at it again, novel virus, coronavirus, I'm not a medical expert, I don't pretend to be, but I find it deeply suspicious that the numbers were escalating towards 80,000, and suddenly the numbers diminished dramatically from a exponential growth level to a less than 50 cases a day, and trying to make the argument that all the cases were now imported cases, meaning people traveling to China and infecting people from being infected abroad. And for me, I viewed that, and I think the numbers will bear it out one day, when actual people are able to learn from different internet chat rooms and medical professionals on the ground that are seeing the actual cases and trying to report the cases, but unable to do so for fear of reciprocity, etc. I think that the numbers will bear out the fact that the Chinese realized that they wanted to propagate and change the locus of the center of the outbreak from China to Italy, rebranded as like an Italian coronavirus or an American virus. You saw that with Twitter, the foreign minister for Twitter, the foreign comms person for Twitter, or for the CCP on Twitter, was arguing that the U.S. Army, was somehow to blame for the coronavirus. So trying to shift the locus, I think, made them realize if we just don't report the numbers, it'll look as if we're no longer the leader in this, and therefore the rest of the world can't handle it. What I think is probably happening, and again, like, I'm not a medical professional, I don't pretend to be, but I think what they're using is coronavirus is killing you in addition to something else, and rather than reporting as coronavirus killing you, they're saying like the underlying medical condition is what's killing you. So like in America, when they say, oh, so and so died of complications from coronavirus, they're reporting both. Person died of coronavirus, but also they had they had lymphoma or some other crazy thing. And rather than saying, oh no, the person died of lung cancer, oh no, they also died because of complications because of coronavirus. And I think you're just having an underreporting scenario. And I think the numbers will bear out as it goes on, because I mean just the population, the density of China alone, I find it deeply suspicious that they were able to contain cases in such a dramatic way. But we'll see if the numbers bear that out.
All right, so we are just about out of time. This is going to be my last question for you, but it is a doozy. It is very multifaceted, so take your time with it, please. So you've seen politicians come out like Senator Tom Cotton and say that China is going to pay. The first part of this question is, do you think that they will end up paying for this? Do you think the Trump administration takes this issue up before the election, after the election, or if at all, if you don't think that they're going to end up paying for it? And what does China, quote, paying for it look like? Are those new tariffs imposed by the United States? Is there multinational cooperation in imposing tariffs on China? Does the U.S. and the West fundamentally rethink China's role in the WTO and their role as co-founder of the WHO? And what can they do with these two institutions to, quote, make China pay, if at all?
I've seen that. I think that's more of a saber rattling tactic, if anything. I don't see a situation where the Trump administration feels comfortable getting into another trade war. I mean, we saw the trade war basically ended up where we were more or less at the same spot that we left it. Maybe a few additional IP protections that we'll have to see how that plays out as businesses go forward. Obviously, as the market's been destabilized here, a lot of our gains, at least market-wise, production-wise, certainly corporately, I don't know how those gains haven't been erased, if not become irrelevant anyways because of the crash. I think what those guys are trying to get at is making them compensate us somehow for the medical costs of this, which are going to be just incredible. I mean, people are gonna die in hospitals in very expensive ways, and there's gonna be no one to pay for it. And I think figuring that out is going to be very, very complicated. I don't see a situation in which China pays for that. I have no reason to believe that they would. I think we also don't have the stomach, I think, to really withstand the prolonged battle that we would have to beat China in any reasonable way when it comes to pushing them out of the trade organizations or getting them sanctioned by the UN or anything like that. I mean, I think that's all of that is just going to be complicated. I think the big learning from this is the fact that we trust we don't trust them in a lot of areas. We don't trust them really in business. We don't really trust them when it comes to trade, or certainly not, when it comes to the military. But I think that one of our learning processes from this is to understand that we need more people to be experts at China, to be able to speak Mandarin, to be able to, read their different chats, read their different, a lot of what happens is like coded language on their different internet platforms. And I don't know that we have the sophistication to do that. I mean, that's one way that Chinese experts were able to figure out that there was sort of a repressive revolution that was trying to get going after the Arab Spring, is that people were able to read the chat rooms, which were using coded language to try to get people to meet up together. I mean, the Hong Kong is a great example of that as well, where they're using different types of chat rooms and platforms to kind of coordinate information. I think that one of our learning mechanisms going forward is we need to get better at that, and we also, I think, expected that they would tell us the truth when it came to something as serious as a biological weapon for all intents and purposes, where that can spread around the globe and kill us all. And I think that we trusted them to tell us the truth on that, and it's been shown that they don't tell the truth, and we need to be prepared that they're not going to do that. And so I think going forward, coming up with some sort of international relationship that forces China to allow objective, global leaders or global medical leaders to come in and inspect situations early and get an actual read of what's going on the ground. I think we need to demand that. We need to see that comes through. I don't know how, I don't know what form that could take, but I think that needs to be something that happens immediately.
All right, that is just about all the time we have. Tyler, thank you so much for joining me today on The Elephant in the Room with Bradley Devlin. Also, if you haven't heard my full breakdown on the timeline of how China really bungled this in the beginning, go back and listen to that coronavirus episode. It was just a few episodes ago, so keep your eye on everything that's developing there. Also, give Tyler a follow on Twitter at @TyGregoryGrant. Stay updated on everything happening China and coronavirus, as well as keep an eye on his future pieces about China as we experience the full fallout of this thing. So Tyler, again, thanks for coming on. We hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thanks, Brad.
All right, awesome stuff from Tyler, of course. I look forward to having him back on the show probably soon with the fallout that the U.S. government's going to have with China in the wake of this whole thing, or hopefully, we get more folks on board to and hopefully we get more folks in not only U.S. politics, but internationally, in Germany, in the U.K., in France, to not punish China, but accurately assess what their motivations are, how their country operates, how their politics operates, and go forward with a more informed strategy to combat China and its influence in the world, given what's happened over the course of the coronavirus. And I know it's been a crazy episode. It's been a negative episode. All these episodes have been so negative, except for that one about the Loco Madness bracket. You got to go watch it if you haven't seen it. But with all this craziness circulating with the coronavirus, lockdown, social distancing, and all, and what's happening in the economy, what's shaping up to be a massive recession, let's bring some positivity onto this whole thing. I mean, I think it's incumbent on all of us to find some sort of silver lining in these trying times. That means, of course, it is time for the Warrior of the Week. So musician Nathan Shepard gets the Warrior of the Week this week for using his skills on the guitar to raise money through Facebook Live in order to donate to those in need during the COVID-19 pandemic, raising $235 in one day. Shepard used the money he had earned to tip a local waitress. The server he ended up giving this money to was a woman named Jessica Young, a single mother of 3 who is waiting for a new kidney and pancreas. Scary time for her, so our thoughts and prayers obviously go out to her and her family. Now, Shepard didn't wait when he gave her that money to see the young woman. Now, Shepard actually didn't wait to see Young's response. He opted to write a note on the back of the check when he left that big tip and leave before he could see her face. To Shepard, the situation, obviously wasn't about him and the people who donated. according to Shepard, he did that because the situation wasn't about him giving her money. It was about all those people who donated, whom he called the real heroes. And of course, shout out to all those people who donated to Nathan Shepard and his cause. What a great thing to do. Actually, the owner of the restaurant, Tracy O'Dowd, contacted Shepard after he left, sending him a text that read, "I pray every day, but tonight after you left, I dropped onto my knees and sobbed while I thanked God for providing to my employees what I could not." I mean, honestly, amazing, amazing stuff happening across the United States. We're just not hearing all too much about it because we are so consumed with this pandemic and what's going on in the world, for good reason, of course, but honestly, we have to remember the good things. We have to focus on the good things. We have to focus on the greatness of America and the American people and our neighbors. So good on you, Nathan. Good on everyone lending a hand and helping their neighbors to be helping their neighbors to the best of their ability during these incredibly tough times. So, all right, that does it for us. Tough times. Again, we applaud you. So golf claps to Nathan. And I hope to see what he does soon in the future. And hopefully he can change someone else's life. And hopefully he can continue to get donations to keep changing people's lives. All right, that does it for us here on The Elephant in the Room with Bradley Devlin. Make sure to keep up with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Also, this podcast, as I said at the beginning of the show, is now a show that is available on Lone Conservative's YouTube channel, and we'll be cranking up the production of The Elephant in the Room. And people are calling it TEITR on Twitter. I'm seeing that now. TEITR, The Elephant in the Room. Kind of like it. Let me know what you think by tweeting at me at Bradley Devlin. But we're ramping up the production of The Elephant in the Room while we are all quarantining together. So once a week we will be doing this show. So keep an eye out for all of our new content coming out soon. Make sure to like and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, SoundCloud, wherever you find us. Help us out and do that for us. So thank you so much for watching this episode. We will see you next week with a whole new episode of The Elephant in the Room with Bradley Devlin.